Shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Hey guys, Spirit of the Lie here. In this deep dive, we're going to be looking at a major shakeup that's happened to early game food sources, and definitely calls for a closer look. As of the last patch, there's now a 50% chance in Arabia to roll unpushable wild chickens instead of deer. Though it's not just Arabia being impacted, with these also showing up in the middle of the map arena as well. Somewhat confusingly, there's actually two different types of chickens being added at once, with herdable ones having collars and are controlled like sheep, versus wild chickens, which are the new deer alternative. We'll be talking about both, especially to give a sense of how chickens compare to all other early game food sources, and determine what the pecking order of the animals really is. We'll start though by comparing the new herdable chickens to sheep. It feels like the majority of DLCs have added some new variation of herdables, with all except the water buffalo and cow at this point being effectively sheep reskins, though herdable chickens are now another new category. First, they have just 65 food compared to the typical sheep's 100, but then have smaller line of sight as well. That makes them worse at scouting, which is unfortunate as you find these specifically on Nomad, where early animal scouting can be quite important. To make up for that and having less food, you'll notice they always spawn in groups of either 2 or 3. Pairs of chickens then end up with more total food than a single sheep, and have more combined scouting ability, so are actually a net positive. Villagers also collect food from these at the same rate as sheep, so I see them as a bit of extra flavor, and you can expect to see these half the time on Nomad going forward. Both sheep and herdable chickens on Nomad collect on paper at just under 20 food per minute for each villager, depending on the time it takes to switch from one to the next, though obviously Britons are a major exception, with closer to 24 food per minute from a Civ bonus. Now just to be clear, these should not be confused with the new wild chickens, which spawn in clusters of 6 to 8 on Arabia, and are the new alternative to deer. To really understand how these fit into the Arabian food web, so to speak, I think we should first talk about the other early sources of food to set up that discussion, starting with boar. Boar generate along a square at its closest 14 tiles away from the edge of the town center. Luring the boar within 8 villagers taking from it under the TC ends up being somewhere around 22 food per minute per villager, plus or minus a tiny bit based on where on that square it was placed. That's much better than sending out villagers to get a boar without luring, which would end up being closer to 16 food per minute, compared to even that 19 to 20 of shepherds. Luring boar basically switches them from being 15% worse than sheep to nearly 15% faster at gathering, and there's a reason it's considered a very important skill to learn. Needless to say, elephants and rhinos are even slightly better overall, as those hold more food, and Mongols can even get up to numbers very close to 30 food per minute per villager with a typical lure distance, though in general I don't want to get hung up here on civilization exceptions. On the other extreme of early food sources, we have berries, which are widely considered the worst early food source. On paper, villagers working on these collect around 5% slower than sheep, but are actually far worse than that. With 4 villagers in a mill, it takes a little under 12 minutes to gather the full 750 food from berries, and after accounting for the fact that I staggered the creation of the villagers to model how this is usually done, it all averages out to about 17 food per minute, just a little ahead of our awkward-looking long-distance boar strategy. As will be important when we get to deer and wild chickens though, we've introduced an extra problem by having to build a mill. That is, unless you find a way to push or lure your berries, neither of which I've personally had much luck doing in the past. That 100 wood for a mill takes villager time to collect, and with a Dark Age lumberjack, requires a little over 4.5 minutes of work to recoup. If we factor that in, suddenly berries drop from 17 to a little over 15 food per minute, which is remarkably similar to what you get from Dark Age farmers when you account for the farm's wood cost over its lifespan. In case you're wondering, doing the same thing without a mill brings the average down to about 10 food per minute, so as expensive as the mill seems, it's definitely not something to skip. Admittedly, this hasn't been a lot of talk about chickens yet for a chicken video, but we're just setting the stage, and we're about to get a lot closer by moving on to deer. As of the current patch, deer spawn between a 20 and 28 tile square distance measured from the middle of the town center, and somewhere in that band, you have a 20% chance of a group of 2 deer, a 45% chance of 3, and then a 35% chance of 4. Now there's 2 ways you could try to get that free food. The first is pushing them with a scout, which actually turns out to be the fastest possible food source from your villager's perspective, and can easily net over 24 food per minute if they're pushed directly under the town center. The problem is you're giving up a lot of scouting time to do that. Even pushing at the shortest 20 tile spawn takes about 40 seconds per deer, plus another 15 for the scout to get back to the deer patch. pushing instead from the farthest possible spawn is closer to a minute 20 for each deer, assuming you don't get distracted and have any deer walk back. That's potentially a lot of scouting information to lose, and even more important than the amount you uncover can be the timing of seeing something like a military building or your opponent going forward with villagers. The alternative is to mill deer, which you don't actually see players do all that often for various reasons, which should become clear. If we take an average deer spawn distance and send out 4 villagers to build a mill and collect them, the efficiency of this is going to depend on how many deer we're talking about, as the mill costs the same no matter how many there are. For example, if there are just 2 deer, including the mill and walking time, it ends up netting you a pretty unimpressive 13 food per minute, landing roughly between taking berries and boar long distance. As you increase the number of deer though, milling starts to look better, and with a group of 4 deer, milling them is actually overall a slightly more efficient way to get food than berries, albeit you'll only end with about 480 food from 4 deer instead of 750 food from foraging with the same mill investment. You can see why players have always gravitated toward pushing deer, especially for groups smaller than 4. Milling obviously looks slightly better with a Japanese bonus, and much better as Georgians if we include their mule cart as a free temporary mill, or even Armenians who can use their mule cart afterward as a lumber camp. For a general sense, with a generic civilization having a 2 deer spawn, you'd actually be better off just walking out and getting them with a group of 3 or 4 villagers, as your average collection rate is similar or even slightly higher than having to make up the 100 wood of a mill. Of course, there's the added downside when long-distance collecting deer like this that there's no chance to force drop off, and in some cases you may have technically gathered enough food to click up, but if they don't drop it off for another 45 seconds, that might not do you too much good. Finally though, we have the context to really evaluate how the new wild chickens fit into all of this. In some ways, they're very comparable to deer, spawning in flocks of 6, 7, or 8, though unlike deer, they can't be pushed. At first, it kind of looks like you can, but they pretty quickly turn around and waddle back to their flock every time. A few things to note off the bat are, like herdable chickens, they have 65 food each, compared to the 140 of deer. But unlike herdable chickens, still collect at that faster rate of deer and boar hunters, while also carrying the same 35 food per trip. Interestingly, as a strange quirk though, they decay at half the rate of deer and about a third that of boar. Those things together mean just 2 villagers can take all the food from a wild chicken in a single trip, getting 56 out of the 65 possible food from the chicken. It seems to me the idea with the slower decay rate is that you aren't as punished for gathering from multiple wild chickens at once with smaller groups of villagers, where having just 2 villagers on a chicken end up grabbing a similar percentage of the food to having 4 villagers on deer. Another way they're made less punishing to collect is chickens also spawn closer to the town center than deer, actually at a pretty similar distance to boar. That's a handy fact to know, as if you do a couple of loops around your town center with the scout and spot your boar but no chickens, that means you probably have deer on your map generation and can plan accordingly. The generation of chickens or deer at whatever distance is also shared between players, by the way, so it's not like one player can roll a closer group of hunt or a different type of animal than the other. Of course, we have to repeat our earlier test, and given their shorter spawn distance, you could just go out and grab chickens with 2 villagers and no mill. This can be repeated for any number of chickens, and at an average distance, nets you 57 food in a little under 2 minutes per trip, for an average of 15.5 food per minute. That's better than 4 villagers walking out to a deer given their farther distance, and land roughly between milling 3 and 4 deer as a reference. The point is, it might feel strange because we've trained our intuition to not like long distance walking for villagers, but it's not as bad of a strategy for wild chickens, and even ends up being about as efficient overall as berries, as long as you're sticking with groups of 2 villagers. It turns out though, milling is actually an equally viable way of collecting them. With the minimum 6 chickens, it's almost an identical result to walking out to get them once you factor in the mill's cost. Though with 7 or especially 8 chickens, it starts to look outright better to mill, collecting that food notably faster overall than even foraging berries. It maybe shouldn't be a surprise that milling 6 chickens ends up being similar to milling 3 deer and 8 chickens to 4 deer, as the total food involved isn't that different, though chickens are maybe a little safer as you're closer to the town center. That fact also means there are some creative ways to play around the need of a mill entirely, with the main one being if you happen to have a woodline close to your chickens. In that case, you could collect all the food some villagers can carry and then build a nearby lumber camp. Any villagers assigned to building the camp will automatically drop off what they're carrying when it's finished, before moving on to wood, letting you snag some extra food without the cost of a mill. The advantage over deer in this case is how much closer chickens spawn, so they're much more likely to be on the way, so to speak. But it's admittedly a situational trick. So to overview all of the sources we've covered during the video in a more digestible way, giving some full context, here we have those food sources ranked by collection speed with either a deer map spawn on the left or a chicken spawn on the right. There's no question you're losing your fastest early game food source on a chicken spawn, dampening potential aggression by both players and impacting very tight build orders. However, keep in mind chicken spawns may also give some extra reward for aggression by having more exposed villagers for scouts or militia to attack, or by giving the opportunity to lame someone else's chickens with early militia or archers as you approach their town. With milling being more encouraged all of a sudden, this should also be a nice boost for a few civilizations, like Japanese, Malians, and the mule cart civs, to all make more efficient use of chickens. The main takeaways though are that chickens are a decent early food source, worth milling with a group of 7 or 8, and are fine to walk out and grab or mill in a group of 6, but aren't as fast a collection source as sheep or especially boar. As for the neutral hunt on Arena, that's a totally different animal. Or I guess technically the same animal, but it feels like something you work into a niche build order for Mongols or Georgians, rather than the more generalizable takeaways we get on Arabia. All this discussion about chickens though, as well as the recent price of eggs, reminds me to mention I've actually been inspired to try my hand at opening my own free-range chicken farm called Spirit's Cluckingham Palace. Order a dozen or book a tour on my new website powered by this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Whether you're just starting or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create a great-looking website, engage with your audience, and then sell anything from products to content to time all in one place. Using either their pre-made templates or Squarespace's AI-enhanced website builder, you can create a fully customized website to suit your needs. It's perfect for building an online presence for a physical business or starting an online store using their built-in tools for inventory and shipping, with plenty of analytics to give you insight about your website's traffic and sales. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/spiritofthelaw to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. That'll do it for this chicken deep dive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.